Hi, everybody. Just wanted to put in a new installment for a presentation. Today we're going to be talking about collecting data. This is actually the longest presentation, but probably will take the least amount of time to get through, which is kind of ironic. We're going to talk about collecting data for qualitative studies, what some of those designs might be, some of the advantages and disadvantages of those designs, talk a little bit about interviewing and what kinds of interviews there are. And it's a little bit more commonsensical than it is, really mired in statistics and things of that nature. When we get into quantitative collection of data, we'll talk a little bit more about statistics. But let's get started. So I'm going to start with the questionnaire, and I'm sure many of you have taken questionnaires for various reasons. This could also be a survey, which we're completely pummeled with these days online. But the questionnaire is basically a set of questions to gain information, and that can be done through the mail. It could be done online, as I mentioned. It could be done via telephone, and it could also be done one-on-one or face-to-face. And some of the advantages of that are accessibility. So you can send out a questionnaire to a very large population, have access to many people that you wouldn't be able to have access to if you had to meet with them face to face. There is a reduction of bias because oftentimes the researcher is not in the area where the questionnaire is being given. Again, if it's done via mail, you just wait for it to come back. Or if it's done online, you have a way of collecting the data where everyone kind of remains anonymous. And anonymity is very, very important in today's world where we really we covet our privacy and our confidentiality. So if anything can be anonymous, a lot of people would be more interested in doing it. And also you may have some structured data sets, which are an advantage. So that means that, if you're looking for specific data, you can structure the questionnaire to help you obtain that information. And there's also an increased time to respond, which is good and bad, and we'll talk about that. It's good because you have more time to give people to kind of allow them to remember information. But the other thing is that you're waiting for the data, so that could be a disadvantage. Some of the disadvantages of questionnaires is that the questions can be often complex, and it's extremely important that you keep them simple and still comprehensive at the same time. You don't have any control over the responders or of what they say, which is actually good because you want to collect raw data. But still, because you don't have any control over them, you also don't have an opportunity to probe further. If there's an answer to a particular question, or if you get a piece of data that you want to find more about, it's very difficult to do that through a questionnaire that you sent through the mail. You may be able to follow up with individuals via email, but then again, then they lose their anonymity, and that changes the entire structure of the study. So oftentimes you need to be able to take the first answer that's given. And also there's potentially low response rates. Unless there's an incentive, whether it be cash, a gift card, or something else, or even the chance of winning a larger prize, a lot of people don't do surveys. Like I said, we're kind of bombarded with them these days, so people are kind of sick of them. But that's definitely a disadvantage you have to take into account. When it comes to the design, you have to think of what kind of information do you really need. So do you need demographic information? Do you need specific kinds of data? That will really help you in terms of what kinds of questions you put into your questionnaire. And therefore, what kind of questions should I ask? There's many different kinds of questions that could be asked. There's open-ended questions, there's closed questions, there's if-then questions. So it really depends on what it is you're looking for. And also you have to ask yourself how you're going to analyze the data from these questions. Are you going to code the questions? Are you just going to look at the raw data? Or are you going to look at the data kind of in the aggregate, meaning the average information? Are you going to look at specific information from different populations or different ages or races or genders or whatever? It really depends on what you're looking for, which is what's going to dictate how you're going to design your study. And the second thing to talk about in terms of design is what kinds of questions are there, where there's simple open and closed questions. A closed question might be a yes or no, whereas an open question gives the responder the opportunity to really kind of tell their story. There are scaled questions known as Likert scaled questions. So you may have seen these before. Please rate X from 1 to 5, 1 being least, least likely to recommend, 5 being most likely to recommend. That's a Likert scale. There are also ranking questions where you can rank things. So not necessarily Likert, where you're picking just one number out of 5, but you're actually ranking a list of things out of 5. So this is my priority. Priority is number 1, then followed by 2, and so on and so forth. That could also be a possibility. You can also have listing questions where you just make a list. So it doesn't necessarily have to do with rank order, but it's a list of things that maybe pertain to a particular question or a particular topic. And again, these are the questions that are asked by the researcher because it gives them insight into specific data that they need. The other is a filter question. You may have seen these kinds of questions like, if you answered yes to question 3, then please move to question 8. And then question 8 is relevant to question 3. So for instance, an example might be, have you ever smoked any tobacco product? If the answer is yes, then the next question is, how often do you smoke? Or when was the last time you smoked a tobacco product? As opposed to if you answered no to that question, then you skip to a question that's not really relevant to smoking. They go on to another topic. So, display logic is something that you can work with, especially in products like, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Products like SurveyMonkey actually have display logic and can really kind of make the questionnaire more interactive for people, as opposed to just being kind of a flat questionnaire. There's also some other questionnaire software programs like Qualtrics, which are very, very very specific with the way that they allow you to set up the questionnaire. But then if you do the pro version, it allows for tremendous amount of flexibility, and that display logic can be all over the questionnaire. But really thinking about it, the design of the questions, the types of questions, and they don't all have to be the same kind. You can have some open and closed, some Likert, some ranking, whatever you want. That design is going to be dictated by what kind of data you want to obtain. So just remember that. That's a very important point. What are some of the problems? Well, there may be some ambiguity and complexity in the questions. As I mentioned before, you want to keep the questions simple. If the questions become ambiguous, it's going to be very difficult for the responder to answer. And they may think that they're answering yes to a particular question, but they're not quite sure. You really want to try to get away from the ambiguity and make the question as simple and as clear as possible. There may be some pre-coding issues as well, so you may want to code the questions later for statistics. And if you code them in a certain way, you kind of have to stick with that. So you need to be careful with how you do that, and the coding really becomes important when you're running the statistics. It doesn't become important for the responder per se, but it's more important for the researcher later on. And if you code those questions in a specific way, you may be stuck with that. So you have to have some flexibility. I don't particularly recommend doing that unless you know exactly what kinds of statistics you're going to run on the data you collect. There may be leading questions, kind of like leading the witness. You may have heard that in a courtroom situation. So you may not want to lead the person to answer in a certain way. That's a very difficult thing to do, I think, also when sending out a questionnaire to a large population. And if you're looking for a particular answer, leading the person into that answer is really going to result in bias, and you don't want to do that. There are double-barreled questions as well. These are questions that ask about two things but only offer one answer to the respondent. So if you have a double-barreled question, you may want to have a ranking kind of a ranking answer, or you may want to have a list answer, but the double-barreled question is not really fair because the respondent probably wants to answer in two ways and you're only giving them one way to answer that particular question. Vague questions, I highly recommend that if you are going to set up a questionnaire, that the questions, as I mentioned before, are clear, they're concise, they're simple, but they're very specific. You can't really ask vague questions because the answers you're going to get are going to be vague as well, and then that doesn't say much about the data you're collecting. Threatening questions, well, you don't want to do that to your subject pool. You don't really want to threaten them. If you don't do this, then, that's that. I've never actually seen that in a questionnaire. If there are questions that relate to topics that could be threatening to your subject pool, that's a different story. So if you have a subject pool that is let's say their religious beliefs, their religious beliefs state that they are right to life, and you have questions that relate to abortion in your questionnaire, that could be quite threatening to a particular group of people. So again, you're trying to obtain a certain amount of data and a certain kind of data. You have to be sensitive to the types of questions that you put in. Also, incorrectly operationalizing concepts. So if you're asking about a concept or theory in your questionnaire and you incorrectly kind of set up the way that theory is posited, or you set up, you do an incorrect setup of the operation of that theory or that law, whatever it is that you're asking about, that also can be misconstrued. So you need to be careful of that. The Pollyanna effect means that people are going to remember all of the positive things about a particular question, or in their answer, they're going to state all the positive, and they're not really going to state the negative. So be careful of the positivity bias, because remember, positive data and negative data can be valuable to the same degree and the same extent. So you really, again, discussing with your research assistant, or even kind of within your own head, figuring out what kind of data you need is going to help you to design your questionnaire and make sure that you don't get that positivity bias. And also, people who might not know the answer, or that it's not applicable. But that should always be, I think, a choice, because you may ask a question about a particular topic and they're not quite sure what the answer is. So that's something that I think should always be included. As far as the administration of a questionnaire, there are 4 major things. First, you should have a cover letter, or at least a leading paragraph of what the questionnaire is and what it is you're trying to find out. That will help to allay the fears of the respondent so that they know exactly what they're getting themselves into. Also, you need to state that they can withdraw from that questionnaire at any point in time without any penalty to them. And that's an ethical thing to do. If there's any incentives that relate to the questionnaire, you can state those incentives as well. If, let's say, you're a consultant to a company and you're designing a questionnaire for that company, you would state that you're a third party that is involved in, let's say, the research or the obtaining of specific data for that company. You have to identify yourself. So you can't just throw out a questionnaire and expect people to respond to it. They really need to know what they're getting themselves into. As far as pre-planning, that's an extremely important part. Just like with any research project, coming up with the purpose of the project, the hypothesis of the research, what the major question is, obviously the methods, but we're talking about the methods right now, and pre-planning, getting that all set up, not to mention the actual logistics of how are you going to send out this questionnaire. Are you going to send it out via mail? Is it going to be online? How long are you going to give people to respond? And what kind of population are you going to be questioning, all of that. So the pre-planning is extremely important, but that goes without saying for any kind of research. The collection of the data. So when will the data be collected? How will the data be collected? As I mentioned before, Many of the online programs such as SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics, they have the ability and they have databases to collect all the information anonymously, but to collect all the information that then gets put into a database, and then that you can see, and then you could do whatever you want with it. So you could dump it into an Excel spreadsheet, you could put it into a SPSS statistical spreadsheet or whatever statistical software you use, and then you can analyze that data. So that's important to understand how are you going to collect the data. The last one is follow-up, and this is a tough one because again, for the respondent to obtain, or I should say maintain, anonymity, follow-up is not really going to be an option unless you state that you will be following up this questionnaire with another questionnaire with either certain people or the entire population or people who get a score of X, or however you want to do it. You need to be upfront about the fact that you're going to be following up with them, because you don't want, let's say you took a questionnaire from some company on I'm trying to think, on the use of their printer, and then all of a sudden they send you, emails constantly, and you really want to have kind of that anonymity. And you'll notice that any survey you take for any kind of product, you could even go to, I remember I went to Discount Tire to get my tires fixed the other day, and they sent me a survey to find out how I like their customer service, but you could put in your name or you don't have to. So again, you could remain anonymous if you want, and if you want everyone to know who was filling out the questionnaire, you could do that too. But again, the follow-up, I think, needs to be an upfront kind of contractual element, that the person knows exactly what it is they're getting into. They know they're getting into a dialogue with a company or a product or whatever it is, and therefore there's going to be follow-up later on based on their answers. All right, so the questionnaire is a way of getting data, and it can be a very valuable way of getting data, but there are definitely some disadvantages. I think the biggest one is that there's a low response rate for the most part, and I think the greatest advantage is that there is anonymity, and that for those people who respond, they probably feel pretty secure answering those questions. The second way of getting qualitative data is through interviews, and I don't know if you've ever done an interview with anyone to collect data, but this is an interesting way of going about collecting information. So it's a very common way of collecting data among qualitative data collection and qualitative researchers, especially in sports science, especially when it comes to sports psychology or psychology, and for that matter, interviews are a very nice way of obtaining data. In many cases, you get low numbers in terms of the population, and the reason is because you have to sit down with each individual one-on-one, as opposed to sending out a questionnaire to a group of 10,000 people, and then let's say you get a response rate of 30%. So you're going to get 3,000 back, which is a huge amount. That's a big data set, even though 7,000 didn't answer. Here, you're not going to sit down with 3,000 people one-on-one. So again, getting the recruitment and the population numbers for interviewing is not as easy as it sounds. Also, there's a variety among respondents, and that has to be taken into consideration. I'm sure some people feel very comfortable being in an interview situation, and some people feel somewhat put off by it. So that can really lead to changes in the way an individual answers the questions that are being given. Also, interviews are often used for exploratory research for further investigation. So you can start with an interview, and then you can kind of move forward and do a more prospective, more quantitative data collection after that. Or you could follow up an interview with questionnaires of those individuals you interviewed who gave you specific data. There's a lot of different ways to use interviews. Let's look at some of the types of interviews out there. The first one is a structured interview, and these are questions that are read by the researcher, and then the respondent gives their answer. It's structured, which is nice, so that the researcher obviously knows exactly what's being asked. and can kind of almost estimate or predict what the answer might be within a range of answers. So it's going to be relevant to the question being asked. There are semi-structured interviews, which are not necessarily read by the researcher, but they're a standard set of questions that are given to the respondent, and therefore the respondent answers and the data is collected. So kind of similar to that structured interview, but again, a little bit more difficult to predict what the answers might be. And then there's the completely unstructured interview where the respondent leads the interview, which is interesting, and you have to have a researcher who is confident in their ability in order to run an unstructured interview, because the researcher is not the one initiating the interview, it's the respondent initiating the interview. So there's a little bit of a different kind of give and take there. And that leads us to the narrative interview, which is where the respondent leads as well, but now tells an entire story. So the narrative interview is a little bit more of the, think of an interview where you would have someone who is being interviewed by, let's say, a journalist, and the journalist wants to find out information about a particular situation, and the respondent tells the story. Obviously, the story could be a minute long, it could be 10 minutes long, but the respondent leads that interview. That would be a narrative kind of situation. Or you can have a focus group. And I think focus groups are an interesting animal, because with a focus group, you're dealing with usually 4 to 8 people, and you are interviewing the group at one time. Now, this is an excellent way to determine the validity of a product, the successfulness of a product. Often, products that we buy every day, usually the researchers, the internal researchers, or the research and development department of the company that put the product out did focus groups. And the beauty of focus groups is they are focused. So if your product is, let's say, I'm just thinking kind of out loud here, your product is, let's say, a mop, or your product is a household cleaner, the focus groups are going to be stay-at-home moms and stay-at-home dads that maybe do cleaning around the house, or it's going to be people who work for cleaning companies, and they're going to ask them, what did you think of our product? They focus on the particular population that would be most relevant to the product they're trying to promote. So a focus group in research is a little bit more product heavy, even though you could do a focus group on anything. If you wanted to, you put out a website, and then 6 months later you do a focus group on the success of the website, on the ability to navigate the website, the intuition, whether or not the website is intuitive or not, is it easy to use, all of that. So again, depending upon the kinds of questions you're asking and the kind of data you want to collect, that's the group you focus on. The beauty of the focus group, though, is that you get dialogue. In none of these other types of interviews do you actually get group dialogue, because they're all one-on-ones. In the focus group, the group dialogue can give you a tremendous amount of data that you would not get from another interview type. So that's an important point about focus groups, and one of the major advantages. So advantages of interviews are that they are experiential for the interviewee, for the responder. They're an experience, right? You're sitting down with somebody one-on-one. It's an insightful means of data collection, because the information that you get as the researcher is going to be much more insightful than if you just send out a questionnaire and get a flat answer back. So in this way, you can follow up with an answer. You can't do that with a questionnaire. In this way, you can probe for an answer. You can't do that with a questionnaire. So that's definitely an advantage. And as such, unexpected data can emerge from your interview, your focus group, or whatever type of whatever kinds of interviews you're using. It's also an assessment of alternative means. So body language. Reading body language is something that is a huge advantage. So you can tell if somebody's getting uncomfortable or comfortable or apprehensive or fearful or whatever it is, and therefore that can tell you a lot about how your question has affected that responder. You don't get that from a questionnaire. And also there's a trust and rapport that is developed between the interviewer and the interviewee. And again, that's something that doesn't come with a questionnaire. And also there's a time context for the interviewer. So you know exactly what day it was, what the weather was like outside, what time of day it was, the date, the time of year, all of that. So all of that can play into how the respondent answered. Also, not to mention, what about the situation in the respondent's life? That can also come into play in an interview, depending upon what kinds of questions you're answering or you're asking. Some disadvantages. It definitely takes more resources for sure to do an interview. You actually have to be there in person, or you have to have a group of people there in person, or maybe it's not just you as an interviewer, but it's you and somebody else. So definitely more resources. There needs to be a place to meet. You don't need that for a questionnaire. There's an addition of bias as well. So again, reading body language is an advantage, but if you read body language that's, oh my God, I think they're getting uncomfortable with the questions I'm asking, it may bias the way that you actually interview the individual. So you have to be careful. The interviewee could become dominant, especially if you use an unstructured interview type where you allow the respondent to lead, or if it's a narrative, you could have an interviewee, the respondent, who becomes dominant in the interview and therefore doesn't allow you to get your questions in. That could be a disadvantage. And the analysis of data becomes difficult because now you're dealing with, it's qualitative data, but it's subjective qualitative data that's very hard to code and very hard to, I hate to use the word, but quantify, right? It's hard to really analyze the data unless you're coding by word or coding by keyword or coding by specific phrases that are said. You have to really understand what it is you're looking for, so when the interviewee gives you that information, you can code it properly and statistically analyze it. So it can, the analysis of data can be hard here. Also, recall and misperception, and having things misconstrued can be a big issue. You have to be careful that you don't misconstrue the answer and that you don't kind of misperceive or use your own perception and say, oh, is that what you meant when you said this? In the interview, you need to be clear about what kinds of information you're getting, in terms of what kind of information you want to get or obtain, but you also need to be very clear about what was said. Many people, when they speak, can be kind of all over the place. Their answer could be convoluted. It can be confusing. So you really have to have clarity as to what was being said. And so that, I think, is a huge disadvantage. Along with the advantage that you're sitting down one-on-one with an individual, the disadvantage is because you're sitting down one-on-one with an individual and they can speak and say a lot, it's very easy to misconstrue what it is that they're saying. So kind of remember that if you're ever going to do an interview for qualitative data collection. Okay. So as far as the design of qualitative data, you want to introduce the purpose and the structure. I mentioned that before. People need to know what they're getting themselves into. You should stick to a plan. So regardless if your plan is unstructured or structured or semi-structured or narrative, you should have a little bit of a plan before going in and be consistent with your questions. Especially you're interviewing 100 people, you need to be consistent with those questions. Start with a softball question. Doesn't mean how was your day. It just means a softball question that's relevant to the topic at hand, but not something that is going to elicit a very complex answer. And what that does is it helps the person who's being interviewed get comfortable with the situation. The question should be clear and concise and also understandable. Don't make them too complex where the person's like, well, what do you mean? You really want them to be clear, but you also want them to be comprehensive enough so that you get the data that you need. And if you are going to ask personal and intimate questions, always save them for last. Do not start with them because you will actually catch your interviewee off guard and they may become uncomfortable. That may screw up the entire interview. So be a skillful interviewer. And although many of you may not be a fan, and I may be going kind of out on a limb here, but I am a huge fan of Howard Stern. I've been listening to Howard for probably the last, I would say, 20 years. I don't listen to him as much these days, but he has become an extremely skillful interviewer. Now, what makes him skillful is that he establishes a trust with the person he's interviewing. Regardless of how famous that individual is, it doesn't matter. They seem to trust him, even though they know they're speaking to millions of people. The trust that he establishes with the person he's interviewing makes them feel comfortable about divulging information that they wouldn't divulge in any other interview. The other thing is, he definitely keeps the discussion moving along. Oftentimes, he will go off on tangents, but then he comes back to the issue at hand. So he may be speaking about topic one, go off and speak a little bit about topic two, but always pulls it back to topic one. Those things are important because once the discussion stops in the interview, you're sort of dead in the water unless you're able to backtrack and bring up something that's relevant that the interviewee will find interesting, interesting or interested about talking more about. Also, do not be judgmental with your interviewer. I don't care if they have a ring, in their ear, their nose, their head, their lip, their tongue. It doesn't matter. They're completely decked out in like gothic clothing. It doesn't matter. If that is your subject and that's the subject you're going to use to collect data, you cannot be judgmental based on what they're wearing, what they look like, who they are, who they know. It doesn't matter. You are an objective interviewer, right? When you're sitting down with this person and you're doing this to collect data. Anything else is irrelevant. So you need to be careful of that, because that, if you do become judgmental, it creates a bias and it can definitely affect not only the way you interview the individual, but the answers that they give. Try to focus and be clear with your questions, and don't use jargon and don't use slang, unless obviously your research is on jargon and slang. But if it's not, don't use that. Try to use actual English language and words that can be understood. And like I said before, be very clear with your questions. Try not to suggest an answer for the interviewer. Again, that can create a bias, and it can create a path with which the interviewer feels comfortable going down, but it wasn't what with which the interviewee feels comfortable going down, but it's not what the interviewee was going to answer. So you have to be careful to suggest an answer. Let the interviewee answer, and then you'll get you'll get data that's more pure than you would if you suggest an answer. Try to probe if necessary, if you can. If the interviewer is skillful and the interviewee understands that they're not just going to take one answer for each of the questions, then probing is fine. Try to get them to elaborate. Try to get them to clarify. Again, remember, misconstruing the answer could be just as fatal to an interview as not getting an answer at all. So if you can get them to elaborate and clarify and be very clear, then the data you're getting is more pure. So we talked about two ways of qualitative data. We talked about the questionnaire and we talked about the interview. And now we're going to talk about two others, observation and content analysis. So first, let's look at observation. This is an unobtrusive method of data collection. It's an alternative to questionnaires and interviews, and specifically, observation does not change the external environment in any way. It also does not provide any interaction of the researcher and the subject in any way. So what is observation? Well, think about it this way. If you've ever seen a spy movie, you'll always notice that there's a scene where in the lobby of a hotel, there's a guy who happens to be looking at a newspaper, but he's part of the team and he's observing what's going on. He's casing the place. He's figuring out where the money's kept, or he's figuring out when the manager leaves on his smoke break so that he knows within that 15-minute window, that's when they're going to break the safe. That's observation. You're observing the environment, you're observing the behavior of the people in the environment, but you're not interacting at all with those individuals. So what are some advantages to that? Number one, you don't disturb the social environment. Therefore, the level of bias is extremely low. Number two, it's a stronger method to measure behavior in a natural environment, right? As opposed to sitting down with someone in an interview, even a questionnaire. Those things may change the natural environment. Access to data will be easier. That's for sure, it will be, because you're observing the data as you go. So the access to the data is easy. However, here are some disadvantages. Number one, by observing behavior, it's very difficult to understand or explain what it is that you're observing. Like I said before, you must be prepared before you do any qualitative data collection. So if you're setting up a coding system for your analysis later on, you have to then pigeonhole the data that you're collecting through your observation into those little coding pockets in order for things to make sense. Otherwise, how do you explain the data? How do you understand the data? It's human behavior. So you need to somehow come up with a kind of a notion before you do the research, and then once you do the observation, put those behaviors into those little data cubicles, so to speak. You're subject to a viewpoint of perception that can begin to get distorted, right? It's your perception. It's the observer's perception. It may mean something completely different, but it is the observer's perception or viewpoint. If that gets distorted, then the data you're collecting then is no longer pure. So that can be really, really tough. It may need expensive and sophisticated equipment as well. Cameras, maybe audio equipment, things of that nature. The other thing that I don't particularly like about observation is that unless the person knows they're being observed, which is possible, meaning you could have somebody looking through a two-way mirror and observing an individual's behavior, but usually in that case, that's in a kind of a confined space or in a lab kind of environment. But if you're doing this in a natural environment, most likely the person doesn't know they're being observed. That, to me, is a little bit on the unethical side. So you have to be careful with that. In terms of observation and how you go about it, you could have single or multiple observers. You could uncover more subtle features of a group and their dynamic, their social behavior, how they interact with one another. That's a possibility. It could be good for understanding the meaning of the data collected, although what I said before is also true, that your perception and your viewpoint as the observer has everything to do with the type of data that's collected and what it means, right? So it could be good for understanding the meaning of the data collected, but you need to be very careful as to what you say about that data and how you understand what that data is and what it means. Observation's a real tough one. So, if that's the way that you're going to be collecting your data, you got to be very sure about what it is that you're observing is pure data and you're not misconstruing what you're seeing. Well, as far as the design of observation as an alternative method to collecting qualitative data, you need to identify the variables. What kinds of variables are you going to be looking at? What's important to you? What is it you need to see? Are you looking at behavior? Are you looking at social interaction? Are you what specifically do you want to know? You need to decide on a sample too. What kinds of people are you going to observe? And where are you going to observe them? How are you going to observe them? When are you going to observe them? All of that has to do with your sample. And then you have to decide how and, well, like I said, where and when are the variables going to be recorded. So is this going to be a descriptive kind of observation, just describing the social interaction or behavior of a group or a number of people or an individual? Is it going to be detailed, or is it going to be more general? And is it going to be reflective? Are you going to take some time after the observation to reflect on what you saw? Or are you just going to look at exactly what you're seeing at that moment in time and collect that kind of data? Here's something to mention about that. So when you're collecting data at the moment, you are, I would say, collecting the purest form of data. Chances are your perception and viewpoint is not going to be as influential on the data collection as if it would be if you reflected on it. Now, you may argue and say, well, reflection is going to bring clarity, and I would say that reflection is probably going to introduce a bias and a change of viewpoint, or at least a different perception of what you saw. Once you have the ability to think about it and mull it over, the perception and viewpoint may change, and that's going to change the data. That's going to change the data, and that will eventually change your report or the analysis of the data, or what you finally publish. So you need to be careful of that and how you're going to record the variables. One thing I might say is that if you had a group of observers, you may want to compare notes after you're done and then see how those notes, how they come out. And if everybody kind of has the same perception, then that might be true. Okay, you also might want to pilot the study, which means do a small observation and move on to a larger one later. That's also a possibility. Some of the pitfalls: you may have too many variables. You may kind of be throwing spaghetti on the wall and see what sticks, going on what's called a fishing expedition, which we've gone over in one of our previous slide presentations. You may be able to not evaluate properly the effect of the researcher, although I don't really find that so much of a pitfall, because the researcher often does not have interaction with the people or the group that they're observing. But if you are in a group of observers, that's a possibility, where there's an influence of a group of people observing the same thing, as opposed to one person observing the same thing. As I said before, the advantage might be that you get kind of this average perception across a group of observers. The disadvantage might be that there's an influence of a group of observers. So, and that could be a disadvantage in that everybody's thinking kind of a different thing. And then now how do you go about it? Now what kind of viewpoint to use, and what's your perception of what happened? Again, this is all kind of abstract, and it may sound kind of crazy, but when you have too many variables and you're not able to evaluate the effect or the influence of the researcher, your data is going to look like crap. So you need to be very careful of that. Also, not keeping track of time and location. Sounds like it's very easy to keep track of time and location, but if you're observing the behavior of an individual, that's a tough thing to do. You need to be able to really stay detailed with that kind of information. And the other is inadequate field notes. So if you're not taking copious notes on what it is you're observing, that could be very difficult too, because then your notes are vague and they're incomplete, and all of that really has to do with the purity of the data that you collect. So we just kind of talked about three ways, right? We talked about questionnaires, the advantages and disadvantages. We talked about interviews and types of interviews, the advantages and disadvantages. We talked about observation and the pitfalls and the advantages. Now I'm going to just follow up with the last way of collecting qualitative data, and that's called content analysis. This one's a very interesting one, because this is basically reflecting on and describing the content of text that's found in a video, that's found in a newspaper, that's found in a book. So what you're doing is you're kind of reflecting on something that's already been completed, and you are coding that information to get qualitative data from it. This can be quantitative, it can be qualitative in both ways. I don't particularly like this method of research. It doesn't mean it's not good, but I've never found it to be incredibly useful. I think that, going to a video and coding for it, just kind of on your own, it needs to be coded in such a specific way. Again, that phrases or keywords that are mentioned, behaviors, movements that are done need to be coded in such a way that if you collect the data properly, then those codes will be appropriate for what it is you're looking at. Now, let me clarify this in a moment, or just take a minute to do that. In much of the occupational therapy type research, in much of the research that's done on autism or done on special needs children, observation is often a way of doing this kind of research. The observation can be done via video or audio, but what has to happen is there has to be a content analysis after the video is taken, because the observation form of the research is done through the video. The content analysis form of the research or method of the research design is done when you analyze the content of the video. I'm not saying it's not a good way to do it. I'm saying for me, it never seemed to be a valuable way of collecting data. I always thought more of a valuable way of collecting data was using quantitative analysis through application or an applied methodology. Now, content analysis is used a lot. So you can identify the text, the video, the newspaper, the book, whatever it is that you're analyzing. You can identify the data that you want to analyze. You can identify the category and the codes that you want to use, and then you place that data into appropriate codes. It's definitely a way of doing research. And like I said before, in many cases, it's the type of research that's probably most common. But I will say this, that content analysis is extremely painstaking, because imagine going through a video of 45 minutes of a particular child or an adult or whatever it is, and looking at their body language and listening to every word they say and listening to the phrases and looking at their eye movement or their, whatever it is. You have to then code all of that. And that coding then goes into your data analysis. It's a very painstaking process and it's very tedious, but it is an alternative to utilizing questionnaires and interviews to get qualitative information. Okay, the last thing to mention are sources of content, and that can be public record, the media, blogs, online, ads, private communications, one-on-ones, autobiographies, biographies, and other types of text. And we also mentioned video and audio as well. So let's just recap for a moment. We talked about 4 different kinds of ways and designs to collect qualitative data. The last one being content analysis. You can also use for quantitative data as well, depending upon how you code it. But the first one is questionnaires, and I'm sure many of you have filled out questionnaires. You kind of know them. They're a little bit more common these days. Look that over and really look at the advantages and disadvantages. And it's kind of, in a way, it's common sense as to what works and what doesn't. But there are many different kinds of questions you could ask and many different ways to go about collecting data that way. The second one was interviews. And interviews can require a lot of resources, can be tedious. However, the insights you might get from an interview are a lot greater than what you might get from a questionnaire. So again, many kinds of interviews ways to keep the interview going and methods to make the interview very palatable for the individual who's being interviewed. The third one was observation, and again, that can be a great way to collect content, information, I should say, or data, but in this way, this could be resource heavy. There's a lot of information that you're collecting, so looking at it reflectively or looking at it in the moment are ways to decide how you're going to perceive what's actually going on. So observation can be helpful, but it also has some pitfalls, as all of these do. And the last one was content analysis. And again, this one can be done reflectively, just looking at a text or looking at a video or a newspaper or an ad or whatever it is. But again, this can be very tedious to do. And for my money, it's not the most valuable way of collecting data. So we went over these ways of collecting qualitative data. The next presentation will be on quantitative data. It's a little bit more in my ballpark. And just know though that there are many, many different ways of collecting information, and it really depends on what kinds of questions you're asking, what kinds of data you'd like to collect. So hope you guys have a great week, and I will be speaking to you soon. Okay, send me an email if you have any questions.